That's
I
what
think it
it's
worked
all
for you.
about, isn't it? Finding what works for you and also what you feel confident, find out what really works. And then I could really find like, okay, this is what that's my perfect race.
Welcome back to Fuelin Sessions. I'm your host, Scott Tyndall, and once again, I am graced by the presence of Daniela Ryf. Daniela, welcome back.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me again. Happy to be back talking about some race nutrition, I think.
Yeah, I think, and firstly, actually, did I pronounce your second name correctly? Because I'm so bad with pronunciations. Was I
Um,
correct or not?
I actually didn't make it take attention, or how do you say?
Reef. Do you
Reef, yeah,
say
Reef is
Reef?
correct. Yes.
Okay,
So,
perfect.
but it's okay. Some call me Rife, but yeah, Reef is the correct pronunciation.
Perfect. I think I stuffed up Jan's last name pronunciation the first time I said it as well. So it does happen. Aussies are notorious for poor pronunciation, especially when it comes to European names and whatnot. But welcome back. I think this one is a really timely episode. I think, well, because I think of the time of year and racing is fully kicked off, but also there was a huge amount of buzz about the Instagram post that we did, which highlighted your race fueling and your winning formula. And to be honest, I mean, it blew up. Thousands of shares and likes and comments, which you have been amazing with actually answering all the comments, which I've been blown away with your aptitude to doing and your dedication. So thank you. And I'm sure all the athletes who wrote comments have been blown away that you're taking the time to respond to them. But I thought, given how popular that post has been, and if you haven't seen it, anyone, please go on to either Daniela's or the Get Fuel In Instagram and have a look, because it's so detailed and it's got a lot of information in it, and it's all based on an email that you sent to myself earlier, which, I mean, it was an essay and it was fantastic. And I thought, why not bring that to a podcast and even break it down further and look at your early career versus maybe what we'll term the prime years. And then maybe even beyond that, what you're now thinking about or how you're thinking about fueling as you've now retired. So why don't we kick it off and say, I think a good reminder for everyone, 10 world championships, 5 Ironman, 5 70.3. I think I'm correct in saying at least 36 victories in the Ironman, and I love
I
it that
don't
you're
know.
shaking your shoulders. You haven't.
I didn't count, but yeah,
You know
thank you.
you've won a few when you don't know how many you've won, but I believe it's 36 victories in the Ironman and 70.3 distance. And I think the legacy is there for everyone who has followed your career, and I think it puts you as one of, if not the greatest long distance triathletes in history. So I think what we're about to discuss now, the learnings you had along your career, are going to be fascinating. So strap in, everyone. We're going to dig in and get into it. And I think the first question I've got, look, we're going to go 2008 to 2014. And our last episode actually resulted in me getting a lot of questions. And one of those questions was fasted training. I was aware that you did fasted training in your early career, but probably maybe not to the extent that I now understand. And I guess my question for you was, how did you initially view fasted training, and how did you use it in your training preparation for races?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the intro, and also I'm happy to share some of my race fueling strategies today and also in the next two episodes. And I think that's where the fasten training comes in also quite handy, because in the end, what we do is we train for the race. And I think I managed to find a really good strategy on how to fuel during the races to not, I did have my races where not everything went good, or where I bonked. But I think exactly that's why I also started to do the fasten training to actually not bonk in the race. And I think it's this combination of you want to be able to have quality in training, but also you want to your body to kind of learn how to deal with situations where, like in a race, you might have a moment where you start to feel low in energy. And I find there's two aspects on the fasting training. I think in one way it helped me to get that extra fitness. Also, I mean, I did have to, coming towards the races, I definitely tried also to get that extra leanness for Hawaii. I think you don't want to do that too early, but I think it's also important to go to get that perfect race shape, race weight without losing, of course, the power. And I think for that it really helped me to get that extra fitness. But then also, and I think might have been even the bigger part, is the mental aspect. And I think I was always quite hard on myself, and I think that's also probably what helped me to race well. And for me, knowing that I can do a session even, without food, helped me also for the confidence that even in a race, if I would lose my nutrition, that I'm also ready for this. And I think having that mental aspect, feeling confident in your body, and that you can also perform without having the carbs. And I think, I mean, the carbs, in my opinion, I looked at them as almost like, I mean, how would you call it? Like extra power, So it's when you have carbs, you can perform better. There's no question about it. For me, I mean, there's other techniques like the keto cops. They have a different opinion, but I think if it comes to racing, you need carbs. Otherwise, you're not getting the best out of your body. And also in training, that's where I played it. I try to specifically decide, okay, this session needs to be a good session. So I would fuel with the carbs. Some sessions, and I think that's an important aspect as well, that as a professional athlete, you train 3 times a day. And we had sometimes 3 hard sessions a day. And so that's why, for example, I would choose to do the first session without any carbs, and then have the second and the third session with quite high carbs. And that helped me to play the game, and also to be able to get that first session in, get the fasting training, but then also be ready for the second and the third, to still be able to put in a good quality session.
Well, I think there's a bit to unpack there, because I'm sure listeners are listening to this going, what, fasted training? Should I be doing fasted training? And I think you did touch on it there at the end, where you said, not every session was fasted, and when you required fuel, you would fuel. And I think that is important for everyone to hear. Let's just go back to where the fasted training came from. We're talking 2008, sort of around that period of time. Who was your coach at the time, and what was the thinking behind the fasted training, if you can explain that?
Yeah, I think the first time I started doing fasting training was in 2008. So just before the Olympics. I had my first coach, who I trained with, was from Switzerland. He was all about fueling well, getting these carbs. And that was, I think, a very good, as a junior, as a young athlete, you want to have a coach who tells you to eat a lot, because it helps you to also not develop any problems. And also just, I think it's important to, as a young athlete, to fuel and eat enough. And then I went to Australia in January 2008. And it's actually quite a funny story, because I remember I thought I was quite fit. It was the Olympic year. I was quite confident because, you would train with the national team and you think you're like a solid athlete. And then you go out to the big world, and you meet. Back then, I was joining the group from Lisa Norden, with Darren Smith and Caroline Murray. So that was kind of the start of this group. It got bigger after, and I still remember I came there, and he's like, "Yeah, tomorrow we're going to do a 2 hour or 3 hour ride. I'm not sure anymore." And I was like, "Oh, okay. So what do we have for breakfast?" Because I stayed at his house. And he was like, "Yeah, you don't need breakfast. You can just it's just an easy ride. And I was like, okay, like, I was quite shy back then, and just tried to do it. And I still remember it was one of my hardest rides. So my system was not used to it at all. And I mean, it's, I think that's where I learned. I mean, I learned so much from this period of time, because just also how they trained, it was very professional. It was very scientifically orientated. So we worked with a nutritionist, and we had really a lot of insights from the science. And I think it was a time where I could learn a lot. And also, yeah, I think fast and training was one of them, that it was, of course, it takes time to get used to. And we did not all of the sessions fastened, of course, but I think to also implement that helped me to also become more efficient. And I think that's the time where I started to realize, okay, there's so much more to nutrition as well than just having, eating a lot. And I think before it was more just eat a lot and you'll be okay. I think I didn't, yeah, I don't think I had the most healthy approach to nutrition. I knew what was healthy, but I also fueled a lot with chocolate, with sugar, and it worked well for me. Like, I think it was like, I remember I think it was in 2003. It was a junior European championship, and we were there, had the single race and then the team race relay the day after. And so I thought, okay, now to recover fast, I have to, eat a lot again to be ready for the day after. So my way of trying to recover fast was just to kind of also a little bit overeating. So I remember I was sitting there with my Nutella chart. Back then it was a 400 gram, so even more crazy. And my coach was like, "What are you doing? Like, you don't need to have that much food." And it was, yeah. I think it's just this fear of not loading enough back then helped me to. I guess maybe sometimes I overdid it, but in the end, I still managed to fuel. But then through that year to come back to Australia and with to Darren Smith, I think that I learned more about how you can really get that peak of nutrition or that peak of performance through a smart nutrition. And that's where I got a bit more deep into the nutrition aspect.
And I think what you're saying there is, and again, it's interesting because I remember that period of time, 2008, all the way through probably to 2015, 16, where there was this emergence of studies and research around fasting. And there was a lot of hype around fasted training, which, we move on to where we are now, and our knowledge of fasted training and whether it's required or not in terms of adaptation and more. Probably what you were experiencing, and it was probably to a degree quite extreme. We wouldn't necessarily recommend 2 or 3 hour fasted training sessions, but what they were doing was an extreme version of periodization. And an episode I recently did with Marco Altini, who you may know, researcher who's based in Italy, he sort of explained a very similar concept to what you are describing. And again, he's European, and he sort of said, like, I just thought carbs were good, and I needed to eat a lot of carbs all the time. And I think that's where there is this disconnect. It's like people either think you have no carbs or you have just carbs. And it's like, no, the whole concept of periodization is using a lot of carbohydrates when you require it versus maybe dialing back the carbohydrates, maybe doing some fasted training, maybe not as extreme as a 3 hour session. I'm sure if we spoke to Darren now, would he agree with doing 3 hour sessions? I don't know. I'd probably like to take a guess that he would look back at that and say, maybe it was a bit extreme and it's not required. But I will also say that, and this is something we've talked about, Danny, isn't it? Like, I know for a fact that there are always periods of time that champion athletes do some fasted training. It just happens. Like, and is it coincidence that all these great athletes have these periods of fasted training? And again, I'm not saying everyone needs to go out and do fasted training, but there are going to be periods of time where you probably don't need to eat something before a training session, because the training session is fairly short, and or you are in a lower glycogen state, and that's from the day before, because maybe you haven't eaten enough to fully load up your glycogen stores. So it's a very controversial area, and I think the message I'm trying to get across here, probably poorly, is that what I think when I listened to you about your fasted training, it was extreme, but it taught you some lessons around when to use carbohydrates and maybe when to hold back on them. Would that be?
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly probably also what the idea was of this first arrival session. I mean, after that, we didn't do crazy things like this, but it was more to get the awareness of, okay, how much do you really need? And back then I was thinking you need, a full loaf or like a 500-gram piece of bread to be ready for a session. And also, let's not forget, I did short distance there. So our sessions, we did have some 3-hour rides, but most run sessions were intense and also not that long. So you don't need to, I mean, the focus needed to be on the quality and not just the quantity. And so what we eventually did is we did some of the easy sessions, not overfuel, or like you said, it's not about cutting them at all, like totally. It's about just having a feel of how much is really needed. And I think that's where also the aspect that comes in, as if you do an hour session, you don't need to extra like have another drink with 200 gram of carbs, because,
Yeah.
or no, 200 is a bit too much, but maybe 100 gram or 60. I think your body is already, through normal food, is already fueled enough for that session. And then you just top it up with maybe a gel or maybe a little bit of a drink and have like 20, 30 gram. And also, I think the aspect of, and that's really important, the difference between fueling just before the session for performance is something different. So let's say you have really important session or like a race, you feel fuel different to if you have a session just needs to get done, and you then can focus more on the long-term health, which is, I would then not take the same. So maybe for an example, like before a track session where it's important, you would then take that extra gel or the carb, or I often also took a Red Bull before a hard session just to be awake. And I think that can help then to have this 1 hour session to perform at your best and get the quality out of it. Where if you have a tempo session where you have to go a bit of threshold but not extreme, you then can choose maybe a more balanced nutrition aspect and say, I'm just going to have maybe a banana, or maybe even, let's say you have lunch. Lunches are a good example. Like, for example, if I knew I had to have a hard session, I would eat mainly pasta to not have the fiber aspects that could make the session after worse. Where if I just had a normal session, I would have, a salad with some chicken and maybe a bit of quinoa or rice. And so this, I would say that's a more healthy lunch for sure. But if you have a track session after, you can't have salad with chicken because it's going to make you not do a good run. And so that's where you also have to differentiate between what's your goal with the food. And I think that's where I think you have to know, like, or for me, it was helpful to know when you eat, what does it help you for? And that's what I learned definitely through that time in Australia.
Which is fascinating. I mean, when I listen to you say that, I think, well, that's exactly what we do with Fuelin. Like, yeah, exactly that. It's based on the intensity and the duration of those sessions. If you've got a key session at zone 3 or above, you're going to be recommended probably a higher carbohydrate meal before that with reduced fiber, and it will tell you that directly. And it's always refreshing to hear what you were doing, it's a fair way. I mean, what are we talking now? 12, oh no, nearly 20 years, 18 years back in 2008. The idea around periodization was there. It was a bit more of a guessing game for the athlete and the coach, and sort of you having to work it out yourself. And I guess that's what we're trying to do, is remove that guesswork. And I think input from the likes of yourself who have gone through this, and through Jan and Holly and everyone else who's involved in the program. I think it really reinforces that message that periodized nutrition can make such a big difference, not only to performance, as you highlighted, yet also to one's health, because you don't need to be smashing highly refined carbohydrates for every single meal
Yeah.
if you don't require it. And I think that's a really important message to get across to people and to athletes today.
Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about the Olympics, and I just want to touch on that because I know I've spoken to Jan about the Olympics and your experience with the Olympics, and how much fasted training was utilized around there, and how did it impact you and your relationship with food and maybe your body at the time?
I think the fasted training was not at all the focus. I think it was more the amount of food you should eat. And I think in the end, I mean, yeah, the Olympics are, a one in a lifetime for many people, or no, a one in a lifetime for some athletes. And I think for me back then, it was really, I was learning that much, and I really took, like, I wanted to do the maximum out of it. And I remember I would get quite extreme, like in terms of, okay, how can I be the fastest runner possible? And of course, that meant also that I thought, okay, if I lose maybe half a kilo or a kilo more, that I can be faster. And I think it worked short term. I think for the Olympics, I could improve very, like, extremely within this 6 months. But also, it was too extreme that I then after realized, okay, I don't want to live like this. And I think it's, yeah, I would really focus so much on the how much I would eat, as well, like the quality. So almost too extreme that I my thoughts were constantly on food, which is as good. It's a sign that you're having a problem. And I think, yeah, that's where I'm a personality who tries to maximize everything. So I think, also with nutrition, I would say it's very, very important and has a direct influence on how you will perform, because, yeah, your body, like what you put in, is having a direct impact on your performance and also health. But it's also, you can also overdo it. And I think in that year, I definitely overdid it in terms of just trying to make the best out of myself. And I mean, I did get 7 Fat Olympics, which for me was like a win. So I felt like yeah, how I could improve was crazy. But then I think the where I started to realize it was not healthy is when I came back from the Olympics. And I mean, it's quite common that the athletes have a bit of a after Olympic depression, and that's pretty much how I felt too. Like I was completely lost. I mean, I was in this training camp for 6 months and came home, and I felt like I was, or even my friends, like they were saying like I was a different person. I had my school friends, and that's where I'm also very grateful for, to have them, that every time when I came back later, they would kind of get me back to my normal state. And I
Call
think,
you out.
yes, definitely. And that was exactly back then where I realized I didn't know anymore how to enjoy going to a party or going to a nice dinner. And that's where I was then, it turned into a bit of the other extreme where, after 6 months of being so strict, like I would, for example, not eat anything that was higher in fat than 8%, which is totally stupid because, of course, you need good fat. And I mean, olive oil, all this is great, great source for your body. But I just overdid it. And I think when I then came back, yeah, we went on like eventually went on holidays, and I just wanted to eat everything bad that was there. So there's just a bit of overcompensating. Put on a lot of weight within I think 2 months, and that's where I realized, okay, this needs to be like a bit of a better balance. And I think the year after, I luckily managed to find a better balance, and for also for my mental health, because yeah, it's not healthy to go that extreme. And that's where I think fueling comes in really well, that it reminds you always in the app to, fuel. And I think if you overdo it, you will see it there. And I think that's a very helpful task to for a yeah, especially for people who are willing to do anything to get better. And in the end, overdoing it doesn't always mean you do it better.
Yeah, I look. I mean, it's. I've heard the story, so it's a recurring story that happens, especially around the Olympic distance, where there is this drive for extreme weight, sort of not weight I guess it's weight categories, but to drop this weight for the run, and it seems to have such a huge impact, as any sort of disordered eating or eating disorder will have on the athlete, and that sort of repercussions, which usually, as you described, that low mood, the depression, that just that relationship with food. And I think it's it's fantastic to hear that you recognize that, but also you had a support network around you and your friends who recognized that as well and sort of helped pull you out of it. Did switching to the longer distance, did that have a positive impact on actually your relationship with food as well, and the way in which you trained?
Yeah, I think it was mainly just environment, like being more in my common environment helped me a lot. So that's why I also enjoy to be more around, like training in Switzerland helped me, because then I could be around my friends. And that's really important. Like I started to realize that was very important for me. Like I was able to go in, just full gas and go to a training camp for 5 months, and but then I would not be happy. So I think over the years I realized, okay, I need to be in a surrounding where I also have my my friends and family. And I think also, for example, what you said with the short distance, I'm not sure if it's for all athletes. Like, for example, I had with Nicola Spirig, I had a very good example. Like she would be having a healthy relationship to food. And I think being surrounded by people who have a healthy relationship to food helps as well, that you don't feel like you have to go that extreme that you can be good. Because eventually, yeah, I mean, you always, if you want to improve, you're trying to copy to people you admire. And so if you have people around you who are also a bit extreme, that can lead to
For sure.
that you get extreme as well. And yeah, I think 70.3 and also the longer distance definitely requires a little bit of a different athlete. And I think that came into my favor as well, because I've always been naturally strong. Like I would say my hip is quite strong, and I can build muscle quite fast. And I think having not having to worry too much about, and actually in the end I could also see that you don't have to be that light. But I think eventually in that I think it was also that phase that people thought, okay, you need to be light to be
But
fast, where
lighter was faster in that period of time,
exactly.
100%. I
And
think
but
that
it's not,
narrative was always there.
yeah, but I think it's not 100% true, because you can be also strong and fast. And that's where I realized what I realized a bit later, like going to 70.3. I think strongness is even more important, especially on the bike. And so having maybe 1 kilo more muscle or two can help you to be stronger on the bike and then also run better. But also, I realized that my running was starting to be really, really strong. So I was quite surprised how fast I could run, and also for a long time. For with maybe I would say my 70.3 years, I was probably 5 kilos heavier to my Olympic distance years, which is quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I felt still really fast in running. So I think that really helped me also to understand, okay, you don't need to trying to yeah, starve yourself, because starving yourself also means that your recovery is slower, and it also means that your training is not quality, and the quality of the training is not as high, because if you do starved sessions, then you can't perform in like at the level when if you feel well.
So let's touch on that because you obviously, you did a lot of this fasted training. How did you recover at that point in time? Like, what were your energy levels like day to day in between sessions? Like, how did you feel when you were doing this? Was it crash and burn, sort of like, you needed to sleep? And because you're a pro athlete, you had the ability to do that?
Yeah, I think the older I got, the more sleep I needed for sure. So definitely, I think the most fasting training I did that when probably from 2015. So after more on the like long distance approach. And I would say in the beginning, I didn't really, it was okay for me because I was young. But I would say from the later years, I started to realize that if I do a 2 hour run without any food, that I would definitely be very empty in the end. And I think that's actually a good point where you're touching here. I think that's often where, when the age group athletes trying to copy the pros, I think that's where a big difference lies, is the pros can then have a sleep after they did their session, where most age group athletes, they go to work. And I think that's where you have a big difference. And the recovery, I mean, I would have sometimes after a long run, I would sleep for 2 hours and really
Yeah.
deep. Like I would be knocked out and wake up like I got run over by a train. And so I think that extreme fatigue is definitely not, I mean, you put yourself into a hole where I think if I look back at, there were definitely a few sessions where I probably did it a bit too long without any food. And that's where I then also start to realize, okay, I can also start a session um like fastened, but then after an hour you start to fuel. And I think for me that was also starting to be a good way to not get that low in energy, and also not get that
Yeah. Do
fatigue.
you do you reflect on some of that? And it sounds like you do, where you go, okay, I probably did take it too far because it led to you having to, I mean, the sign of probably requiring a sleep for 2 hours. And again, for a pro athlete, I imagine you also ate when you came home and then had a sleep. And that's
Yeah.
probably your saving grace in this case. Like, the fact that I know you have a very good appetite and you can eat a lot of food. And so probably that was your saving grace as well, is that because you had a very good appetite when you decided to eat food and you had the ability to sleep, it probably mitigated all that. I won't call it damage, but probably that stress on your body. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, what I, for example, never like to do is driving somewhere and then go for a run. So even that to me was, then I had to drive home before I could have food. So for me, I always, I mean, and also I would say I'm privileged that I can run from my home. Not everywhere you can do that, but being able to, when you come home and feel dizzy, yeah, definitely for me the first thing was run to the kitchen and then have a meal. And maybe I would quickly shower sometimes, but there were also times I came home and just went straight to the kitchen, had food, and lied on the floor and didn't really move for a bit. And I think, yeah, there's, I don't know, like that's actually not one coach actually taught me to do this. It's a little bit self verschuldet is, yeah. And I think that's where sometimes the athletes, or I mean, I can only speak for me, but I think, yeah, I am extreme. I think I would not have been such a good athlete if I would not like the extreme. And yeah, I think sometimes it's also okay to push over that boundary. And I think it's sometimes it was more to test how long can I survive. And of course, it's not a very smart test, because yeah, with nutrition, it's, yeah, then the next day for sure you're going to suffer a bit on the recovery. But I would say sometimes it was a little bit just having, the brain would be like, okay, how strong am I really? And trying to prove myself something. And yeah, I mean, it's when you look back, you're like, yeah, this was not necessary. Like, for example, one session in Maui, it was like 2.5 weeks before the race, and I did a fasting training session. I don't know why I did it. Like my coach even like that was with Brett, and he got really mad at me. He's like, "Why would you do this? You're so stupid." He even said like, "Don't do this." And so sometimes I think,
What
yeah,
was the session? How long did you go
I'm
for
2.5 hours, and I mean I did
on the
have some,
bike?
and on the run, yeah, and without food, and
And a 2.5 hour run as well.
no, only a 2.5 hour
Oh,
run, but I mean that's
only.
enough in Maui, right?
I was
So
going to say.
I
And
I'd have
how did that impact you leading into the race?
I mean, I've done it before and then won, but then I think that year it was maybe just I was getting older. My recovery was getting slower, and then I did get it was in 2019, and I got sick before in race week. If it's related, I don't know, but in the end, yeah, it's definitely was not the smartest move. And it's sometimes funny, like you think you're a smart athlete, but sometimes you still do stupid things, and I don't it's hard to explain why you would do it. I think, yeah, I've done some mistakes, and you learn from them, but then sometimes you just do them again, and it's like, yeah, why?
Look, I think you touched on a couple of things there where, look, the best of the best often do things that aren't the norm. And that's maybe why they are the best and the best. And we learn from that and we look at what they did, and then that gets studied, and then research comes out. And it's like, wow, that's either very effective or very ineffective. I think, again, just so I just want to reinforce, I think what you did was extreme. I don't think it was required. I think it's interesting to hear that an athlete of your caliber did that extreme, and sometimes it paid off, sometimes it didn't. I'm sure the sickness, the amount of stress that applied to the body before a big race, probably, layered up and ultimately could have, certainly would have impacted immune response, which is very unfortunate. I think you also said something that you changed your approach to the way in which you fueled, and I think that's an important sort of aspect I'd like to touch on. You recognize that maybe you didn't have to do the whole 2.5 hours fasted, and maybe just the first 40 or 60 minutes. Can you just elaborate on that and why you did that?
Yeah, I think especially in running, I wouldn't do that on the bike so much, but for running, I always find or I would always try to do the first session. I liked to run in the morning because you don't have then to watch what you eat so much. So I think if you run in the afternoon, you then have to watch what you have for lunch, because then, yeah, you have the stomach, which if you have a lot of
In
fiber,
terms
it
of
can.
GI,
Yes, exactly.
you mean in terms of watching what you eat, not
Yeah.
necessarily watching what you eat for weight
No,
management or anything like that.
GI, exactly.
Yep.
And so that's why I always like to do my run sessions, also some harder sessions in the morning. And so and I think I mean, of course, you can do, some white bread or all the things I told the people what I have before the race, but that's not the best healthy food. So my approach always long term was to the have like my breakfast, for example, would be oats with apple and a bit of milk, and or like soy milk or almond milk or oat milk, and a bit of some nuts. And so I couldn't have that breakfast in the morning before a run, because then I couldn't run after this. So that's why I chose to run in the morning without food. But I still wanted, when I realized I needed still to be able to do the quality, I realized, okay, I need to have something. And so I found, if you have it early in the morning, if you have sugar early in the morning on an empty stomach, it's also for the blood sugar. It's not. I found it. How to say? Like, I found it easier to just start the run and then have the carbs when you need them. And I think that's how I managed to have quite some good sessions without having stomach problems and still be able to get the quality in with the necessary carbs. And once I had done the session, I could then have my healthy breakfast. And that was one of the reasons why. I mean, of course, you can have also a piece of white bread, but for me, it was more like, okay, I'm used to it. I think if I look back and if you want to recover as fast as possible, I probably would suggest some light carbs, then have your session. And if you need more, you have a bit of some long chain carb powder to just get through the session, and then have your proper healthy breakfast after. I think it's a good solution. But I think sometimes also time, you get up and you just go, you have, take some caffeine and then you go for a session. And having to eat, like sometimes it's funny, like before, like in my younger years, I could just eat so much, where through the years I started to not be able to eat that much anymore. So for me, it was a good solution to just take the carbs as you need them.
And just, did you ever, and again, it probably goes a little bit different from what we would recommend with Fuelin, especially, and you did say it, like probably to get better results in terms of recovery, especially for those who don't have the ability to, um, probably go and sleep and have a lot of time afterwards actually consuming some calories before the session. Did you ever aim to consume calories, some carbohydrates, some protein, some fats before these sessions? And if you did, what would you tend to eat? Would it just be a slice of white bread and some jam or some nut butter, or would it be a banana? What would you eat before a session?
I mean, you mean like for during the day, for example?
Oh, and even in the morning, did you
Okay.
always avoid eating in the morning because you were fearful of your gut?
Um, yeah, I just made it kind of a bit of a habit. Like I
That
did
was
have,
your habit.
yeah, I think I had, but it's the same. Like the difference is I had 3 sessions a day. So for me, that one session was not always the most important. It was sometimes also a 40 minutes easy jog. Like I would have, my sessions wouldn't be, if I had a 3 hour hard bike, I would not do it fast. And of course not.
Yeah.
That would be stupid. But if I have a 40 minutes jog, often, for example, I would do a 40 minutes jog, then have breakfast, and then have a track session. I didn't really like that so much, because then exactly you have the problem with what you have for real breakfast. And that means you have to kind of have some, I mean, you can have pancakes or banana or, some, but low fiber. And
Mhm.
I preferred to do my hard session early, have no, for the running now, like just have it with the carb powders I needed to get the quality in, and then have my proper breakfast, which is high in fiber, and also, yeah, quite like high in fruit. And then for example, for the bike and the swim, I never really watched on the how do you say,
The GI,
the
like the gastrointestinal
yeah.
system. Yeah.
I think that's much more forgiving. You can pretty much eat. I mean, or I could pretty much
So
eat
you would
everything.
you would go into those sessions
Yeah.
just fully fed up. So
Yes.
I mean, when I listen to the way that your day was structured, it's similar to how a lot of the research studies have investigated faster training and the evolution of that, because what they would do is typically do very hard sessions in the afternoon or leading into the evening for the individual athlete. The athlete wouldn't necessarily consume a large carbohydrate meal in the evening. They would then sleep overnight, which is like the fast and sleeping low. In the morning, the initial studies would then have the athlete complete a lower intensity session, fasted, and assess the impact of that from a physiological standpoint in terms of markers of changes in terms of the mitochondria in the muscle, um, and performance markers, even from watts and time to exhaustion. I think what's really interesting is that the evolution of those research studies is sort of like the evolution of your fueling, in that what we now recognize that even if you do that overnight fast, consuming some fuel during the session in the morning doesn't actually impact fat oxidation, or the ability or any of those parameters around that session, which was always the thought process for why you did fasted training. So like it's just it's you inadvertently were doing where the research is sort of caught up to, and I think again that's probably most likely what happens with a lot of elite athletes, and what we see in the field is that what the athlete is doing is maybe a little bit ahead of the research, and it's usually an evolution of trial and error. As you said, you realized doing a 2 hour fasted run in the morning wasn't the best idea because it knocked you out. So then having a little bit of fasted, but with food on board, actually made you feel a lot better, and then allowed you to then perform the session. So it's like listening to a history lesson, sort of from the past into the future. So yeah, I do find it very interesting. I know we've talked a lot about training, and I promised at the start of the episode we'd talk about race fueling, but and in a way, look, what we're talking about is fueling for races and training, and ultimately your training is what gets you ready for the race. Um, when we talk about the races and maybe the training, were you focused on back in 2008? Were you focused on carb targets? Like, how were you thinking at that point in time? What was the focus from, you mentioned your coaches, Darren and also Brett Sutton. What was the focus back then? Because, carb numbers around 120 grams weren't talked about back then. I mean, it wasn't until, you were even ahead of the game, I think, in 2015, 16, consuming what you were consuming. The talk of 120 wasn't really happening until 2020s. So
Yeah.
back 2008, how were you thinking around your fueling for 70.3s in terms of grams per hour, stuff like that?
So I think it's quite a big difference between the Olympic distance and then the
For
7.3.
sure.
I mean, a short distance race, or how do you call it? Yeah, Olympic distance race of average 2 hours. I think we did pretty well there. Definitely over fueling or taking too many carbs was not needed. I think there I found I had my, I always feel like you can feel the if you have enough and you can push as hard as you want, then you kind of feel it. And I definitely feel like in the Olympic distance I could go all out for 2 hours, and I felt like the nutrition or the fuel was not never the thing that kind of held me back. It was more my heart rate, or my lungs or my muscles being lactating. But I think, yeah, I would say there we took. I'm actually not sure. We had a very clear. I would have to look it up if I would find it again. But I think, yeah, we would feel well before. I mean, and that was always my strength. I was back then. I still remember I was able to eat so much before a race. I think maybe also a little bit because I was watching my weight during all the training sessions, and then for me it was almost like coming to a race. I was like, yes, I can eat like carbs as much as I want, and for me it was almost like a bit of a celebration. And I remember, like I think in Moluluba one year where I think I got third. I had I think I had like 400 gram of white bread, and I don't know. I think back then I often had tahini um, and honey. So another 100 gram of tahini sesame spread is like 800 calories. It's a lot of food, or a lot of yeah, fuel. And so for me, it was always about having. So I would eat quite early before the race. So for sure, 4 hours. So I would make before the Olympic distance, I would have 4 hours before the 70.3, I would do 3 hours, because I felt the shorter the race, the more sensitive your stomach, because you're just going to be at a harder pace and also a harder in a harder zone. So yeah, I mean, the intensity you go in an Olympic distance race is insane. You just
Yeah.
basically see blue, and you want to yeah, you want to vomit. Like from the start you start running, and not because you had you ate something bad, just because it's so hard.
So
And
intense.
so for me it was always important to have early breakfast and have good breakfast. But then in the race itself, it was, I mean, yeah, you had to get yourself through. You had to have maybe, I think it was around 60, 70 gram for the carbs. but that was it. I think that was enough for the Olympic distance because the race is only 2 hours, and then you have maybe one gel in the
And
before the run.
we would still recommend around that amount. Look,
Yeah,
athletes will consume somewhere between 40 and 60 grams in the
yeah,
bike, and then 1 or 2 gels maybe on the run,
yeah,
because
and
it's a 10K run. I mean,
exactly.
I
So
don't think the fueling in session fueling for Olympic has changed actually a lot. I think what is interesting though is
is the longer
the
distance exactly?
70.3 and the Ironman, and what 2000 and what 2013,
Yeah, so that's
your first
2012.
70.3, was it 2012, your first
2000,
70.3?
yeah, I did the Olympic distance till London, and then I switched to the 70.3, and that's
Okay,
where,
so 2013 then.
yes, exactly, and that's where I was on my, like, I didn't have a coach in that time, so I kind of just asked around a bit, asked my friend Jan van Berkel, asked Ronnie, just that I was in 214 before my first Ironman. I was like, well, hey, Ronnie, you've won Ironman Zurich a few times. What do you take? And I think back then, yeah, the average was, what was it, like 4 gram of carbs per, no, 4 calories per kilogram. So around, so I was like 65, 60, 65. I would always sum it up to like maybe 70. And that's around, what's that, 280?
About
Yeah.
280 calories.
Yeah.
So you're working off what, 4 calories per kilogram or something like
Yes.
that.
Around
And
that.
you
And
and you weighed what you were saying, you weighed around 70 kilos.
no, actually, I was, so I just summed that up. I was around 62. So I was
To
pretending I was
40.
70,
Okay.
but I
Yeah,
was like,
okay.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
to just
Okay.
be
So you
safe.
pretended you were 70, and
Well, to just have
you
the, I was, it was more about, um, my theory was, I prefer to have a little bit more than too little. So in terms of carbs. So that's
but it's
why
fascinating, isn't it? Because you thought you were taking in
a
high
lot.
amounts.
Yeah.
You were like, oh, I'm just going to bump it up to 70 grams an
Yes.
hour. But if you look then at what you were doing later on, yeah,
Yeah.
you'd
Big
almost double,
difference.
well, over double
Yeah.
what you were taking in. So, and back then, how long was a 70.3 taking you?
I mean, I was quite good in 214 already, so it didn't take me that much longer than later, but maybe 4 hours 15 for 20. And
So, and
so
you were still moving back then on 70 grams an hour, which
yeah, I think
is
so.
interesting.
Yeah, that was a really interesting time because, of course, I had all the knowledge from the Olympic distance, and also on sodium, and also the sodium bicarbonate, which we did already back, like in the Olympic times, and then I was like, okay, how do I now transfer that to the longer distance? And so it was just a little bit of experimenting as well, and I think I did Wiesbaden, and then I did Las Vegas 7.3 Worlds, and I realized like, yeah, I mean, I was okay, but I didn't feel like, I think for 70.3, I was almost okay because back then I still was managing to eat the 2000 calories before the race. And I think
Yep.
if you have that buffer, you kind of already have yeah, I always saw it as an advantage to be able to eat that much on race morning, because it gives you that buffer that when you then during the race can't or don't take that much, that you then still have this little bit extra in your body. And I think it was more 2014 where I started to rethink the nutrition again, because I knew I had to do this race in Zurich, which was taking forever. I back then I never really thought to do Ironman racing. And I remember my coach was like, okay, I think you should do Ironman because I think you're wasting your time with doing other things. And I didn't really, I was, or let's say, I didn't want to do, but I think what the problem was is I was scared to do it because I thought it was just too long. And so I had this idea. As I was like, oh, okay, that's really long. Like, it's a full day of racing. So what do I eat there? And I mean, there's some funny stories on what I thought to have. And so that's where I reached out to Jan. I was like, hey, like, what do you think if I would have a chicken breast at the 90K mark to just get, a bit of protein to get I kind of thought for some reason that I need to stabilize my blood sugar. So I thought, a bit of protein could help with that. And I did also think, and we can talk on this for, later on, the mistakes. But the chicken breast I never did, so I'm glad I never tried that. But
I'm glad you never did that.
yeah, but I think it was a good phase to just also think like, what could you possibly have? And so in my first Ironman, I definitely was quite creative. I had some crackers on the bike, just because I felt like they give me this, yeah, it's just stabilization. And also mentally, I thought I need to have something in my stomach. So I did have still a bar with, I think, 200 or
Do you remember what
300
products you were
calories.
using? Do you remember what products? I only asked that. I'm not asking you to give a plug to any particular product. It's just interesting because I think in today's world, all the athletes are just so inundated with all these different gels and products that I think they've been around forever. But actually, back then, the choice was quite limited, wasn't it? And the choices were pretty horrible in terms of flavor and consistency.
Yeah, I don't think it got much better in terms of consistency and flavor. Like, it's still not nice to take a gel, I find. But
You don't like the gels?
no,
Come
no,
on, some of
I.
them are right. When we get into the
I
prime
mean,
years,
there's
we can name drop a few products that
yeah, I
neither
mean,
of you
there's
used. But
Beta Change has one that's with almond spread and honey, which tastes quite nice, but that's
did
not
you
something.
use Whole Food? Did you ever use Whole Food sort of gels in your early
Not in
days?
racing. I mean, for training, yes, because that
Training,
felt
yes.
like a better, healthier option. And
But the reality is they're not.
yeah,
I
and
mean,
then they also
and
had the
also you don't know what's actually in them, as
yeah.
was
I mean,
demonstrated by the Spring Energy fiasco, where I mean they were claiming what 40 grams of carbs was it, and it had half the amount. I
really?
mean,
Oh wow.
that's the issue with. Yeah, look, I understand that thought process of around, oh, okay, it's apple or it's nuts in these gels and things like that, especially the fruit carby ones. I understand the concept, oh, it's raspberries and bananas and things, but the reality is you want to be using the carbs that are proven to actually be
Yeah,
performance enhancing, which, I hate to say it, that's glucose, it's maltodextrin, it's fructose, and
yeah.
you might as well take it in the form that's been studied.
Yes, and you don't want to have that, acid or like for
Oh,
also
yeah. I mean,
the
you talk about GI distress. I mean,
yeah.
that's probably the quickest way to do it through some of those whole food, baby food type gels.
Yeah,
I
I
think
think
taking it off.
there's also was quite a trend with the fatty gels. I think I went
Yeah,
through them
Jan
as well.
mentioned about the fat gels,
Yeah,
and I
they
was
were
like,
horrible. They
wow,
made
that was the low carb, the low carb, high fat sort of
yeah.
era. And what was one of those fat gels like, honestly, to take? Was it
Well,
like
it
eating butter?
no, it was not that. No, the taste was okay, but I think it was also mentally again. I felt like I had something more than just sugar, which in my head gave me the feeling I had some real food, and that would
Mhm.
then help me to not bonk. So that was kind of my thought
which
process,
which
which is
unfortunately is the wrong
it's
thought
not true,
process,
I
isn't
know,
it?
but
Yeah.
I think it's also by learning these things. And in the end, I mean, I did take, even in my best races, I did take some like not in a gel, but like Nutella has a lot of fat, for example. We
Hmm.
did see that. It also, many people commented it on the post, and I think that's where in the end, where I try to find the solution is, okay, pre-race like food, it doesn't, in the end, it's about what can you actually swallow. Like sometimes I was so nervous, I would sit in front of a piece of bread and like going like this, and I just couldn't eat it because I was just so nervous. And so if you have the option of having nothing to maybe some banana with Nutella, go for that, because even if it's not
100%.
healthy, it's going to help you to get some calories in. And in the end, that's what you want. You want to have calories in, and that doesn't make you throw up. So it's kind of these two simple things.
Yeah, I mean, look, and the context is so important. And again, what you're saying there, it's all about context. I hate it. It is one of those bugbears where it's like, look, end of the day, we know swallowing a lot of glucose and maltodextrin and fructose and that in day to day is not going to be great for you. But in the context of you're about to go and do a 4 hour or an 8 hour or a 12 hour or a 16 hour race, that sugar, and we'll just call it sugar just to umbrella it, is going to be the best thing for you because your body is going to require it and you're going to
Yeah.
use it. You are
Yeah.
going to use it. And I think it's that notion of, oh, it's not healthy. No, but it's again, if you actually look at the way in which the body utilizes, I mean, you talked about insulin, like the way in which carbohydrates are shuttled into the muscle is independent of insulin.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't understand. I was talking to Professor Stu Phillips. We were talking about this. It's like, even when he was saying like people were on these fasted sort of crusades, and then they'll say that they're taking BCAAs, branched chain amino acids. And he's like, well, you do know they're insulinogenic. And they're like, what? And he's like, the whole reason you're fasting is to, supposedly improve your insulin sensitivity and reduce blood sugars, but actually you taking the BCAAs actually spikes your insulin. And it's sort of, and I was saying, oh yeah, the same discussion is around consuming carbohydrates during exercise. And they're like, oh, well, that's going to spike my insulin. It's like, no, actually your insulin is like low, really low, if like zero pretty much during exercise, because
Yeah.
it's independent of that mechanism. And so it it's always interesting listening to how people, I think what fuel does to them versus what actually is happening with the fuel inside them. And did you get nervous because you hadn't eaten or practiced eating, or was it just you were nervous? Like, were you worried about having GI issues and eating the food because you hadn't necessarily done a lot of that in the training?
I think I always try to do my, like, whatever I if I mean, I found my gel and then I kind of kept what I used. So I did at some training session I would kind of do a, how do you say, like a fake race. But I think once I knew that worked for me, I felt like I didn't have to train it so much anymore because I felt it was so dialed in for what is well for me. But
Yep.
I think what I was often nervous is, yeah, because you burn so many calories during an Ironman, and especially in the beginning, I was always very worried. Like, okay, I need to eat a lot in the morning, and then sometimes even the day before. So one time before the Kona, I had my friends Maddie. We would always have a carb or a sugar like how would you call it, a
Like
carb
a sugar
party.
party or a
Yeah, so
carb party.
always the night before the race, I would eat just really a lot, and so again I overdid it once, and we did, or I ate a full block of ice cream. So like, I don't know, like 1.5 liters. I don't know what it, but it's like 3,000 calories. And I mean, also I think a lot of sugar, but I think the fat is probably, or also the milk fat was probably not the best. I had
Bit too much.
a little bit of a problem in the morning, but I felt very fueled. So I
For
think
sure.
in the end, yeah, that I wouldn't do again. But what I learned is you don't need to go crazy, but it's a lot what you need. So
For
I
sure.
felt like I would have to eat so much, and I mean we do it, and then sometimes it's almost like, disgusting how much you have to eat. But I could even do more than that. So I realized, okay, you don't have to go that extreme. You can just have maybe 2 3 portions of pasta, and that's okay. You don't have to then also eat the full bulk of ice cream. And same in the race morning. Like, I had race mornings where I felt nervous, and I mean, I was always nervous, but I had 1 2 race mornings where I could barely eat. And so then I just had some of the long chain carb powder, where of course you can, if you have 100 gram of that in a drink, you also have at least the 400 calories, which is not that much, but it's going to help you to also be okay. And I think, and I think that's where it's important, as long as you keep fueling, that's really important. So once you drop, it's where it's hard. And I find it also interesting that before, like earlier in the years, you also say like you can only have sugar by the end of the race, which is also not true. Like you can start with sugar, but you just have to
Absolutely.
keep filling it. And if you stop, yes, then you have a problem. But that's where even I think, and that's where the planning is very important. You have to kind of set yourself a goal and really, even if you feel bad, you have to take it in, because if you don't, yeah, you can maybe reduce it a tiny bit, but if you don't take in at least 80 gram, 70 gram per hour, you're going to have a problem fairly soon.
There's a couple of things I just want to touch on. I know we're probably nearing time, but the ice cream story reminds me. I remember when I used to work with, you may remember her, Sarah Piano, and she hadn't. We were working on her taking on a lot more carbohydrates, and she did the same thing as you. She went and she's like, carb loading. Brilliant. We are doing a practice carb load. And she went and bought Ben and Jerry's, and she bought about 4 tubs of it and ate about 2 liters. And the next day was just all over the place in terms of just feeling terrible. I think mainly because of the amount of fat. And so I think it
Yeah.
is a good learning. The second thing was, it sounds like you did a lot of experimentation with carbohydrate loading. Did you ever quantify? I know you weren't big on quantifying things, like you didn't use a heart rate monitor, you didn't use a power meter. Did you quantify the amount of carbohydrate? You mentioned like a carb party in the evening, but did you actually ever measure or understand how many grams per kilo you should be consuming across that day leading into a race like Kona?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my strategy was just, yeah, kind
Eat as
of
much as you
eat
can.
as much as you can and just a little bit more than that. And so, yeah, definitely what I did is I started 3 days out. Or actually, no, that was before for the Olympic distance. We did 3 days just to get really,
Fascinating.
yeah. So it was a long carb build up. You would feel sometimes even a bit, blown up. So that's can be mentally a bit a challenge, but I think it always worked well for me. And same for the 70.3 racing. I think doing 2 days, I started doing 2 days. So three was a bit much also because that means you drop the fiber. So 3 days of no fiber is a very unhealthy nutrition, and because you just
It's
basically
okay
can
for
eat
3 days.
plain food.
It's
Uh,
not too bad for 3 days, but
Okay, yeah. So
um,
I thought two is better. So I think, and it was also for me. I think it felt like it was enough. But I would mainly focus on having real food, and then maybe just the day before, where I also had some of the long chain carb
some
powder.
drinks and
But
things.
yeah, I would
Did you
have to
ever and
calculate. You can.
did you ever calculate it, just out
No,
of
I never
interest?
did.
See,
Yeah.
it again, it's like a history lesson because and Alan and I, Dr. Alan McCubbin and I just covered this, and we're going to release an episode on this, is the history of carb loading, and it's sort of and talking about like what we now know is just as effective. And it used to be like 3 days of glycogen depleting, and then this period of time, 3 to 4 days of carbohydrate loading. Then it went from having the glycogen depletion to just having 3 days of carb loading. But exactly what you described, a lot of athletes didn't like that because actually they put on weight or felt bloated for 2 or 3 days before a race where you've been starving yourself to be as
Hmm.
light as possible. So then now it's actually only really, we know, 24 hours before the race, getting
Yeah.
up to around that 8 to 10 grams per kilo is what is required. And it would have been amazing. Like I just think it's always would have been lovely. And full disclosure, you never used Fuelin for your racing. It would have been lovely for you to see very clearly, 2 days out, okay, we're increasing the carb amount 6.5 grams. Day before the race, okay, now Daniela, you got to go 10 grams per kilo as an absolute minimum. And then you're structuring your day from the morning right through to the evening, trying to finish hopefully, 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. So it's not too late.
I can
And
redo
actually
it.
see, yeah, I think
I
it would
can,
be
no
a really
problem.
interesting.
I know pretty much what I would have. So it
Maybe
was always
we
quite
do
a,
that.
yeah.
Maybe we do maybe we set it up. You do an easy 3 hour
Oh.
bike ride or something and an hour and a half run off or something. You can do that. And but we set it up and we do like Danny's demo carb load based on what she sees in Fuelin. I think it would be a really interesting experience, and to see if the amount of food at 10 grams was similar to what you did, or was it less than what you did? Because I do also know that athletes of your caliber often go well over 10 grams per kilo. 10 grams
Yeah.
is probably the minimum we want to get you at. And so, yeah, I think it would be really interesting just to see what you ate. I'd love to,
I mean,
review what you ate and the quantities and see if you actually hit the numbers.
yeah, I mean, I could definitely do that. I think you also can't underestimate the nerves. And I think that's
For
often
sure.
where some people, yeah, they know, okay, I should have that. But then when it comes to the race, it's always a little bit different because you have the nerves, and then so it's you might not be able to get the same in. But that's where also, I mean, I would 2 days I would have the pasta and
Mhm.
still a bit of meat, and then my ritual with the glass of red wine. So
Geez, that caused a little bit of controversy, didn't it?
I
You
know. I
you having
mean,
a glass of red wine. I was
I'm
like,
not
oh my
promoting
god,
red wine
people,
here,
it's yeah.
but
But I'm
I think
like,
it's
if
yeah,
you feel
this
better with a glass of red wine, like go for it.
yeah, I
Like,
think it's more a mental thing.
yeah.
But
Would
yeah,
I recommend it to an athlete? No, not before a race. But if hey, you went and won five Ironman and 570.3 World Championships, I think it seemed to work. I did laugh at the comments where people were like, "Oh my," like saying why, or you shouldn't have done this on the on that post, and I'm like, I think it worked pretty well for her. So I think every athlete will have their sort of idiosyncrasies and their
yeah,
weirdness about them, but
and that's what
I think it
it's
worked
all
for you.
about, isn't it? Like finding what works for you, and also what you feel like confident with. And once you have that, like it needs a few races, and it took me maybe a year and to find out what really works, and then I could really find like, okay, this is what that's my perfect race. And that's I felt, and that's exactly where we're going to talk, I think, in the next episode, like what's the tuned in race kind of nutrition for me, and go maybe a bit deeper on that. But it takes
Yeah,
time to practice, and also to just find out what you're capable of taking, and also mentally
that
being able to take. Yeah.
and I think that's a great segue into the next episode when we get there, because it's the consistency, isn't it? And I love hearing that from someone like yourself, where it's like it doesn't happen overnight. Like you just said, it took you at least a year in those formative years to work out the race fueling strategy and hydration strategy to then become the champion that you became. That's a
And I
lot
would
of
say that's quite,
patience.
yeah,
That's a
but I
lot
would
of
say that's
patience
still fast. I think there's some other athletes, they took longer. And that's
for
where
sure.
I'm also keen to help, like to share what I did, because I find like it doesn't, some, yeah, I find some people overcomplicate it. It doesn't, you don't have to, some things which might help you eventually or make you have a better blood composition might not be what you want in a race, because it's all stress for the stomach. And in the end, it's like focus on what really matters, and that's the carbs.
Yeah. No, I agree. So, in these formative years, in the early years, just as a summary, 2008, 2014, you did faster training, fairly extreme faster training. You then went about manipulating that faster training and changing that over time to include some fuel. You carb loaded for extended periods of time and then reduced that down and found what worked for you. Race morning, you sometimes struggled, you sometimes got in a lot, but generally speaking, you were aiming to try and get in as much carbs as possible before the race, which again, we would 100% reinforce that notion of a carb load and race day morning and practicing that. We definitely stress that at Fuelin. In terms of race fueling, you mentioned, so would you say on average you were taking in around 70 grams an hour on the bike in those early years? That was about the limit?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
like at the first Ironman, it was that in that year 2014,
Yeah.
where I might have gone up a little bit, like 90 gram, but
Okay.
it was not enough. So I mean, we all saw what happened in the race. I had a great bike, and then started running, and then I think one of the biggest mistakes was also my approach to fizzy water, which I thought it was really refreshing. And I did have yeah, another mistake, which then I learned definitely from. I did have one aid station with fizzy water, and yeah, of course, fizzy water has 0 calories, which is maybe not the best thing to take. And that's exactly, I would say, 5K after that aid station, I bonked. And so
Yeah.
that really showed me also how important it is to really get up, keep in the carbs for the run. And I think that's where then the year after I definitely changed a lot and still made some mistakes. But I would say, yeah, I went up to 90 gram into 14 for the 70.3. Back then I was probably even lower at 70, 80 gram,
Yeah.
which, yeah, compared to what I then had the years after is yeah, almost half. So it's
Yeah.
crazy how much more you can put in. And
Yep.
also there, like of course, maybe it's also a little bit related to that I pushed more watts on the bike. So can't forget that I got stronger. So then you have also a little bit of a higher demand. But I think, yeah, back then it was just trying to find, like coming from Olympic distance where it was totally different. Like the pre-race fueling was, I would say, more important. And then you kind of could almost do the race with one bottle and one gel. And it's definitely a different story in 7.3 and Ironman. And I think it's also
Sure.
interesting that, yeah, I would say my biggest fear always before a race was, okay, will my stomach handle everything? And can I take in the food? And I think I always knew if I do these two things, I'm going to perform because I was fit and I was healthy. And, it's these things you can prepare, and the food you can prepare as well. But in the end, you still have to execute it on race day. And then you have stories like you lose your bottle, and yeah, then you have to just also be a bit flexible. And that's, yeah, then
Yeah.
it's a bit of a mental game.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. I think the evolution and as I said, the next phase of you and the difference of how you approach the fueling, I think is, and I mean, it obviously relates to more to that post, but I think having an insight into what you did versus what you started with, I think is really interesting for people to hear because a lot of people have probably heard and probably can relate to some of those mistakes going out, doing a long run and just not consuming enough and feeling the effects of it and probably having to go to work straight afterwards and then wanting to die the rest of the day and not having the luxury of being able to sleep for a couple of hours. So I think things like that, bonking on a run after a hard bike as well because you haven't taken enough fuel. And I think these lessons that you learned, I think we've seen that time and time again through age group athletes, through professional athletes. And I think it just shows the power of nutrition. And
Absolutely.
when you get your nutrition right, it can certainly be a game changer. And I think ultimately that's what we're trying to do with Fuelin and educate athletes on how to use nutrition to I guess supercharge their performance and also their health. And I think education sessions like this are always an invaluable part of that process. So, Danny, thank you for today. I know it went longer than what we anticipated, and I'm glad, just as a FYI for everyone, this was going to be rolled into prime years and then after years. And I did suggest, and Danny suggested, maybe we break it up into 3 separate episodes. And I think that's a good thing. Otherwise, we would have been going Huberman style of 4.5 hours or something like that. So I think it's a great sort of preface to the next episode, which is your prime years, 2016 to 2019, and really listening and hearing what you did to sort of supercharge Danny's career.
Thank you. I look forward to it.